Tycho, the noseless, dwarf-fighting, CHADS astronomer. When exploring the history of astronomy, many names come up such as Galileo, Copernicus, and Kepler. However, there was a scientist who was CHAD than all these versions put together. Tycho Brahe is easily considered to be the Ernest Hemingway of the scientific renaissance that swept Europe. From looking at stars to kidnapping peasant girls, Tycho has purposely been left out of modern history books for being too brash and childish. Academia believes he sullies the high elitist class, popular scientists have been known to have. But I believe this god amongst man must be known for the exploits that ascends him leagues above others for the time. Tycho Brahe was born in 1546 to a wealthy family in Skåne, Denmark. Or present-day Sweden to be exact. When he was 2, Tycho was kidnapped by his aunt and uncle when left alone with the infant while Tycho's parents were visiting one of their other children. Though it's only speculation, historians believe that Tycho's uncle and aunt could not have children and were jealous of the other family, stealing one of the 12 children. He would be raised and educated by his uncle, becoming the heir to his estate while pursuing higher education. While most of the Brahe family was known for military experience, Tycho would not pursue a military life and chose to study law. Or would until a special event would change the young man's life. The solar eclipse of 1560 is regarded as a historical event just for the sheer panic that caused around Europe. To scientists and collegates the event was natural, but imagine being a God-fearing shit farmer working in the fields only to look up and see the fucking sun get blacked out. For Tycho this event would change his passion from law to astronomy and changed his academics shortly after. The change would also have Tycho travel to new colleges around Northern Europe, where he would encounter his first run-in with notoriety. In 1566, while at Rostock University, Tycho would have a disagreement with another student. The argument escalated until the student challenged Tycho to a duel. Now remember, Tycho was a pacifist by nature and had never engaged in any battles or swordplay in his life. However, like the CHAD he was, the madman attempted to duel for the first time in a life-or-death match. The result was not in the young Tycho's favor. He ended up losing his entire nose before yielding. Tycho would wear a metal, prosthetic nose for the rest of his life. At the end of his schooling, Tycho fell into even more wealth from the death of his father. His inheritance allowed Tycho to now continue his studies back home with a vast estate at his disposal. But that wealth would originally be put to good use. One of Tycho's most famous discoveries was of one of the first supernovas recorded. He published the discovery and his research in an essay, De Nova Stella, or the New Star. Unable to publish with a real publisher, this alpha bought a printing press and editors to self-publish his essay and bought distributors to spread it across the scientific community. Now, thinking he was a big name in astronomy circles when actually no one knew who he was, Tycho dedicated all his efforts to recording as many stars as possible within the night sky, their movements and position over years. The final records showed 1006 stars. And I will remind you that the telescope would not be invented for another 15 years. You would think this absolute madman just sat outside all night staring at the sky, but not. This CHAD basically said, I want to look at the stars while also in the comfort of my home. So he converted his grand hall into an observatory, and had a throne constructed that would be leaned back mechanically by servants so he wouldn't strain his neck. Needless to say, his name was becoming known around the Danish for his eccentric scientific practices. A name that would attract another young scientist to Tycho's home. John Kepler. Yes, that John Kepler had just finished schooling to become an astronomer when he became a partner to Tycho. Kepler was not much a fan of Tycho than he was of the sheer amount of research Tycho had documented. So the young Kepler kept a simple relationship for many years with the now adult Tycho. As Tycho grew older, he became much more of a party figure of Denmark, hosting several events for aristocrats to come and party with him. These parties could only be described as the 1980s office coke parties of the late 16th century. Wanting to entertain guests, Tycho made a few investments to entice new guests. One of these being a fucking moose that he had shipped from the Americas. And to tame the beast, Tycho had his servants spike the animal's drinking water with alcohol. So guests were surprised to see their drunk host ride a drunk moose into dinners and gatherings on his property. The moose would drink itself to death a few years later. Of course, all of this partying was avoided by his lab partner, Kepler, who continued his research on nearby planets. Years were kind to Tycho. He was a powerful figure within his community and carried a lot of influence with his wealth. However, his lack of influence in astronomy circles irritated him. At the time, the debate between heliocentrism and geocentrism was heating up. Galileo was losing influence to Nicholas Copernicus, who had just published the world-changing book, On the Revolution of Heavenly Spheres. Tycho, through his observations, believed he discovered the true answer. If he wasn't taken seriously by the scientific communities now, he was mocked by his declaration to how the grander solar system was structured. Tycho presented the self-titled Tychonian system. A bizarre, lazy attempt to compromise the two sides of the debate, where the Sun revolved around the Earth and all the other planets revolved around the Sun. Even more retarded, the Catholic Church supported this system and wanted scientists to disprove this. When Galileo wrote about the phases of Venus, the Church still wouldn't abandon the Tychonian system. Go back to John Kepler, who was growing into more of an autistic need while studying with Tycho. He eventually would publish his own discoveries that would help shape modern astronomy and how the universe is structured. Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. His studies back the heliocentric theory of Copernicus, and even Galileo agreed with the premise. But Tycho threw a bitch fit about how the research and observations was his and the credit should be his. Kepler basically told Tycho to "Fuck you, I won't do what you tell me! Fuck you, I won't do what you tell me!" Fuck off, which started an autistic dispute between the partners. The dispute would continue until Kepler ditched Tycho after gaining EXP from his essay. Now looking for a replacement, lab assistants found the job to be a revolving door since Tycho was so toxic. At some point in his later life, Tycho had done something to anger the Danish king, which Tycho then threatened as a response. Immediately afterwards, the king of Denmark forced out Tycho and his family to Prague. There he would continue his research for a few more years. It is worth mentioning that in his later years, Tycho was growing more rambunctious and out of control. For example, Tycho had a jester of sorts played by a dwarf. At a party, Tycho got into a fight with a dwarf, yet not firing him. Foolery like this was increasing his notoriety in Prague, but also sparked controversies as well. In 1601, Tycho attended a banquet in Prague. Drunk, the man feasted for hours with guests. It is recorded that the monster went 6 hours without using the bathroom while putting quarts of liquid into his body. At age 54, just 11 days later, Tycho Brahe had died from a burst bladder or kidney failure from the banquet. Well, until 2012, when the German government had an autopsy on his remains. Poison was found in his blood and stomach lining. Now historians believe Tycho had been poisoned at the dinner by someone who disliked him, which was plenty. Most speculate that the dwarf had done it in order to get some sort of revenge, which is most likely. But the more interesting idea was that Kepler had hired someone at the banquet to poison Tycho so that Kepler could swoop in and buy the research off the family, which he ended up doing anyway. This theory is more of a conspiracy, but it is worth noting that the dispute over research rights to Kepler's laws was still going on without a clear owner. After 400 years of obscurity, Tycho is becoming known once again in modern times. His actions reflecting the actions of internet celebrities and hypebeasts of the present. Tycho Brahe is a lesson of how not just the discoveries of a man can make him a historical figure, but the lifestyle and actions can and will determine how history perceives him, if it remembers him at all.